Well, thank you all for, just thank you. We are thrilled to welcome our final panel under the leadership of Dr. Huda Zraik, who we are honored to have moderate this panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Zraik, for your time. In this panel, we will have 3 experts explore the challenges and opportunities to advance publicly engaged scholarship. So thank you to all 4 of you. And Dr. Zraik, the floor is yours.
Oh, I didn't open it, thank you. Is it now it's working? Yeah. I'm very happy to be moderating this last session in the conference. For those who do not know me, I'm a public health scholar, researcher, and professional, social justice in the academia of public health is a very significant value and practice in our teaching, research, and service. Public health started as a very medical field, but eventually there was a recognition that you cannot understand health in society if you don't understand the societal, economic, political factors that influence health. And so public health has moved closer to the social sciences. And we are very happy that Satine has recognized this in the Arab Council for Social Sciences, and she considers us a related discipline. So I hope it's an important comradeship that we've had with Satine over the years, but I think we are now within her institution and within her structure. And I hope this conversation, many of us in public health are part of this table, and I'm very happy for this conversation to continue. We have a very important session, but before we move into the session, I have been asked to remind you of this evaluation forms and to do it early so that you don't forget. So don't do it on the time of the session, but do it before you leave, please. All right? We have a very significant session today and very distinguished speakers. The session is on publicly engaged scholarship, and these days we cannot think except in having scholarship publicly engaged. We have 3 speakers, Dr. Patrick McGreevy, who is I know Patrick, but I was given, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the American University of Beirut. And he will be speaking on the idea of university autonomy and the challenges of the 21st century. We have also Dr. Ahmed Dallal, who is the previous provost at AUB and currently a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at AUB, and Bassam Haddad, who is, Bassam, you are a professor of, Director of the Middle East Studies Program and Associate Professor at the School of Policy, Government and International Affairs at George Mason University. And did I say that Ahmed is going to speak about the role of public intellectuals in the changing landscape of higher education, and Bassam will be speaking on context, opportunities, and limits. Now, the speakers are supposed to have 15 minutes each, but they have been negotiating, some very strongly, for a little longer time. So we'll see how it goes, and this is the last session, so we may be a bit generous, I think. Okay, we start with Patrick McGreevy, and the floor is yours, Patrick.
Thank you. In April 2015, Terry Eagleton published an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled "The Slow Death of the University," in which he lamented the erosion of the distance that traditionally existed between universities and society at large, a distance that enabled universities to, quote, reflect on the values, goals, and interests of a social order too frenetically bound up with its own short-term practical pursuits to be capable of much self-criticism. The critical distance, Eagleton continued, is now being diminished to almost nothing as universities capitulate to the hard-faced priorities of global capitalism. Eagleton's critique apparently touched a nerve. The slow death of the university was listed first among the top reads of 2015 that most strongly connected with the readers of the Chronicle of Higher Education. Eagleton is particularly concerned with the capacity of the university to serve as a center of humane critique. For him, humanities in particular must be a protected site from which to launch a critique of conventional wisdom. This is one thread of an enduring proposition that universities' relationship to their societies in which they're embedded, and in particular their relation to power, whether it's embodied in the state or in other forms, should be one of autonomy and separation. The university, from this perspective, can best play not only the role of social critique, but also its other roles of pursuing knowledge and educating individuals by remaining a place set apart from the world around it. Eagleton is reacting in part to the relatively recent transformation of higher education in the UK through the state assessment exercise, which awards points and fuel and funds, especially for contributing research with an immediate economic impact, which Eagleton says is turning universities into ancillaries of entrepreneurship. But the new system in the UK is just one manifestation of a similar transformation of higher education that is much more widespread. The growth of what British anthropologist Susan Strathburn calls audit culture has been justified by the idea that legitimate stakeholders, future employers, taxpayers, legislators, parents, and others, want universities to focus on certain practical kinds of research and job training, and to some extent to cater to the immediate needs of corporate employers who now demand specialized job training be completed at universities, training that used to be the responsibility of corporations themselves. In the view of some scholars of the contemporary academy, the ultimate roots of this situation lie in neoliberal policies that have led to an increasing concentration of wealth almost everywhere. These fundamental economic changes have been accompanied by new concepts and assumptions, a cultural logic that addresses each as an individual. Education becomes almost entirely a private concern. Its benefits are individual, so its costs must be individually borne. This has alarmed a great many academics and spawned the new field called critical university studies. Now, in my view, we must be careful about waxing nostalgic about the wrong things. A few short decades ago, British universities were more separate and more autonomous, but also more elite. They may not have been for the 1%, but they were certainly for the 5%. The democratization of universities began in the US with things like the GI Bill in the early 1950s and expanded until more than half of all high school students had entered universities. And similar, if less dramatic, democratization followed in Europe and many other parts of the world, and even in the UK. A research university, when it's working well, has as its central feature a commons. Research requires a conversation that is profoundly open. Academic review and debate assumes that more wisdom emerges from such a process than from any one person thinking alone. In essence, it is based on a commitment to thinking as openness to the questionability of things. It also implies an equality of participation. That is, scholarly questions turn on the value of the insight and the argument, not on the status of the person speaking. The academic commons demands that privileges of rank, social status, and the like are irrelevant, at least theoretically. The heart of the teaching function is, as Jeff Noonan puts it, awakening and cultivating the love of thinking. While information acquisition and skill development are always involved, they are not the end of education. That involves the cultivation of thinking and questioning. Higher education succeeds and research succeeds when students and faculty members experience a conversation that constitutes a commons. But what happens to this commons when confronted with the onslaught of neoliberal pressures and their cultural logic? What is de-emphasized is the role of higher education in educating citizens to think and to question so as to participate more fully in democratic life. Democracy requires that the rights of free assembly and free speech are not confined to campuses. They are the rights of all citizens. Historically, the question of academic freedom became urgent in higher education at the exact moment when wider freedoms were being demanded by Enlightenment thinkers and contemporary political revolutions in places like France. This conjunction implies that the university's autonomy and its preservation of open debate and research is directly connected to the development of spaces of civic freedom that is outside of the university. But under the logic of neoliberalism, higher education is no longer a public good. Education is addressed to individuals as something to be privately consumed. The danger here can be grasped by an analogy to what has happened to the urban street. In democracies, the right of assembly and free speech has a location. These things exist in the street. That is, they exist in public space where issues can be contested and negotiated. No one has the right of assembly or free speech in somebody else's house, only in public space. Shopping malls may seem to replicate the function of the urban street. They certainly look like an urban street. But if you try to take a photograph or hold a little demonstration against a retailer who, say, discriminates against women, you'll find that you are in private space under the control of owners. Contemporary political economy almost everywhere leaves university presidents with little choice but to chase the concentrated wealth now in the hands of fewer and fewer billionaires. Presidents may attempt to maintain a wall between the desires of such owners and their own decisions about education and research. But knowing well that they must go back to these donors again and again, and knowing that their own leadership will be judged partly according to the resources that they garner, means that the wishes of donors may play a key role in setting university priorities. Hence, there's a danger that campuses will become less like the street and more like the mall, places where people are addressed only as individuals who consume, places where a community of inquirers is out of place. When wealthy donors demand accountability, it is similar to the US Supreme Court ruling that defines corporations as people who have the right of free speech. But money not only talks, it can also drown out human voices. The university becomes shot through with private power and a cultural logic that demands that students focus like a laser on getting ready to enter the job market and to turn away from the conversations that have traditionally been at the heart of the academic commons. People like Eagleton worry about the power of concentrated wealth to breach the university's walls. He would like stronger walls. While I completely understand this argument, it is the realities of higher education in the Arab region that convinces me that there are more dangers in demanding separation than in encouraging engagement. There are a host of new universities in the Gulf that claim academic freedom within their walls, but have very little connection to any zone of civic freedom beyond these walls. The proponents of the establishment of branch campuses and similar internationalization schemes by Western universities often argue that these institutions will be agents of long-term positive change. I understand that these campuses may introduce progressive ideas. They may allow young women access to an education they would otherwise not have. And to the extent that these students experience a genuine academic commons and they cultivate a love of thinking and questioning, these campuses may slowly help subvert authoritarian regimes. Others, however, argue that such initiatives help to legitimize authoritarian regimes, especially when they coexist with Western military bases and political support for these non-democratic regimes. One thing is clear: such universities have a remarkable apartness from the societies that surround them. The history of the American University of Beirut reveals a very different relationship to its setting, something it shares to some extent with other Lebanese and other Arab universities. In the 150 years since its founding, AUB has increasingly become more of an Arab institution. Its gates are open to intercourse with the city, the country, and the region. So despite its elite connections to the United States and its English language of instruction, it has been a key site in which Arabs have debated modernity and its cultural, economic, and political ramifications. It's a site in which global academic perspectives have engaged directly with anti-colonial movements. Despite the tumultuous history of Lebanon, the AUB campus has remained comparatively open and free. The main reason for this is something difficult to reconcile with predominant Western views of the Arab world. In Lebanon, there has developed a space of civic openness. Perhaps it's forged in part because of the diversity of Lebanon and the need for people to compromise with each other and to negotiate. But if there developed a kind of commons, a zone of free conversation on the AUB campus, it has a counterpart in a civic commons that is palpable in Lebanon's free press, its religious freedom, and its vibrant movements for change. Of course, this is not unique in the Arab region, but it is very distinct from what is happening in the Gulf monarchies. It is this setting that allows AUB to host intense debate on the issues of the day, to remain a key site in the Arab world for the humanities and the critical social sciences. Moreover, because it is an American university in which Arab perspectives are carefully articulated, it has a role to play in an era in which such voices are smothered by Western prejudices or the region's own repressive regimes. The contrast between the history of AUB and Gulf counterparts convinces me that what most effectively protects the academic conversation, the academic commons, is the presence of spaces of conversation and debate outside of the university. I agree with Eagleton that universities should be places to consider things beyond the immediately practical, and to confront how we actually live with how we might live. But engaging with similar impulses beyond the university enriches this conversation and allows for repressive forces to be contested at both sites. If such activities are sequestered in the academy only, they are to some extent contained and neutralized. Now, I know this argument runs counter to the thinking of many academic progressives who are appalled that their institutions are so deeply involved with corporations, governments, and commerce that they seem unfit any longer to question conventional wisdom. But if, in attempting to lessen these influences, we push for greater and greater autonomy and separation, we may lose what we value most. Today, progressive academics are at a complete loss. The forces arrayed against the vitality of the academic commons seem ubiquitous and nearly omnipotent. Fighting these forces from the campus can seem like a lost cause, a rearguard action of hunkering down within nested walls. I want to suggest a different strategy for protecting and strengthening the academic commons. It must reach out and engage with spaces of freedom beyond the campus. The counterpublics forged by subcultural groups, the phenomenon of art striving for autonomy, social movements, the Fourth Estate, the press, the Fifth Estate, non-mainstream media, and other democratic forces that have an affinity to the academic commons because they too value thinking, questioning, and a fundamental equality. Conceiving of universities as open to their surroundings and indeed to the world rather than as bastions of separate freedoms is the most effective way to gain some leverage, to generate a counterforce to the forces that are currently stifling the academic commons. In fact, the space within the university and the space of civic life are both contested domains in which many forces are present. Although there is no complete agreement in either realm, hermetically sealing off one from the other is a recipe for eroding the conversations and engagements that foster hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Oh, my goodness. Ahmed.
Good afternoon. A key difference between an intellectual exercise and one which is public, however we understand the term, is communication. The ability to communicate the outcome of intellectual activity to a public. If so, with the proliferation of communication technologies, one can understandably wonder whether the information age renders the notion of public intellectual useless. I do not think so. Although it certainly makes it different, and more importantly, it makes the terrain in which the competition over intellectual authority so much more complex. And this is not necessarily a bad thing because of the egalitarian dimension of open access to knowledge, which imposes a different kind of public accountability. This can also serve as a kind of a wake-up call to academics, reminding us that communication is no longer tightly controlled by authority, which restricts access to a limited number of communication forums, and that we can no longer easily claim privileged expertise knowledge. But then, are intellectuals, specifically public intellectuals, a dying breed? Do they have to reinvent themselves as media pundits or experts serving power to survive? And if they do, are they any longer public intellectuals? To begin to address this question, we need to specify a bit more what we mean by public intellectual. The Oxford Dictionary, English Dictionary definition that a public intellectual is, quote, an intellectual who expresses views, especially on popular topics, intended to be accessible to a general audience. This definition, I think, is not very helpful. Missing from this definition is the ideal type of public intellectual as an outsider, a critical dissenter, who engages in founded systematic reflection. But not just any kind of reflection, rather one that questions received wisdom and disciplinary assumptions. And to appreciate the difficulty of living up to this ideal within institutions of higher education, let's remember that the word disciplines, which defines and organizes our professional practice, and also defines who belongs and who does not belong within an institutional framework, also connotes punishment and coercion. So in this first sense, a public intellectual is someone who has the courage and hopefully freedom to pursue and reveal truth. I will not talk today about who can lay claim to this title, nor will I go over the myriad representations of this type of public intellectual, a subject that has received significant attention by many scholars, including, of course, the brilliant BBC Reith lectures delivered by Edward Said in 1993. Of course, I would readily recognize the exceptional role of a handful of global public intellectuals with momentous impact. But today, I would like to lower the bar and focus mainly on the less demanding kind of intellectualism one encounters commonly in academia, to talk about a model that is feasible and can be emulated. Not about Noam Chomsky and Edward Said or Stephen Colbert for that, or even Pope Francis, one of the most influential public intellectuals today, who, by the way, is neither an expert nor an academic. And I take issue with your characterization of the panel of experts. I hope I'm not an expert in this sense of the word. So I'd like to focus on us and our roles in institutions of higher education, and talk about a function that is within reach of most academics who choose to take on this kind of challenge. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist political philosopher who was imprisoned by Mussolini, and who famously, by the way, introduced the concept which is now common in our lingo, the concept of organic intellectual, wrote in his prison notebooks that, and I quote, all men are intellectuals, and women, but anyway, but added that not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. Gramsci's notion is less about elitism and more about responsibility. In other words, there is a hierarchy of categories of public intellectual with increasing responsibility as one moves up this hierarchy. And if we apply this notion to academia, we can say, perhaps paraphrase Gramsci and say, all academics are potential intellectuals, but not all academics have in society the function of intellectuals. Gramsci's intellectual, therefore, thinks in society, combines thinking and public action, creates new ideas that attend to social problems and concerns, and communicates these ideas to the world, not just to fellow intellectuals or to political elites and businessmen. And perhaps we can add in a language which is both rigorous and accessible. But to press this idea further, at the expense of departing a bit from Gramsci's egalitarian model and moving closer to the representations described by Edward Said, and again, in the context of academia, it might be useful to identify some activities that do not unequivocally fall under the notion of a public intellectual. What is not public intellectual activity? The first, generic teaching, does not make academics public intellectuals. Teaching is at best a service. But it is also true that educational systems can be complacent in maintaining structures of social inequity. So not even teaching can be taken for granted. Moreover, if public intellectuals are advocates of specific social agendas, one can argue that this role must be suspended in teaching, since academics have the obligation of taking stock of various views in their disciplines as defined by the relevant communities of knowledge, and also have the responsibility of encouraging their students to think critically about the whole range of knowledge they receive. And there's a difference between service, which is part of what educators do, at least in theory, and the critical role of a public intellectual. For example, there's a difference between a scientist taking on creationism as opposed to doing the type of research that may or may not potentially undermine creationism. There's a difference between an economist reflecting on the crisis of global capitalism as opposed to an economist who's working on techniques for maximizing capital accumulation. There is a difference between a physician talking about politics, the politics of medical research, say, for example, why malaria or even morning sickness are not priority research topics, as opposed to simply serving through medical research and healthcare. The second category of things that do not automatically qualify as activities of public intellectuals. Although communicating ideas to as large a public as possible is a prerequisite, simplified presentations to the public are not sufficient to make an academic a public intellectual. Having the talent of communicating with a wide and diverse public is not sufficient on its own. In fact, there is an understandable tension in higher education between cultivating in-depth critical understanding and communication of this knowledge, which often requires simplification. And I think, for good reason in academia, and of course beyond in the case of public, there is good reason why, for example, textbooks do not count, do not carry the same weight as pieces of original research and so on and so forth. Someone who does a TEDx, it's a great thing to do it, and it's, it's a great service. But this type of presentation, I don't think qualifies on its own. It can be, but it doesn't automatically qualify simply because it communicates to a large audience. And third, in an age when scores of academics parade as experts, this role is more likely to maintain the status quo and to serve inequitable power structures than to question power or address social concerns. A public intellectual is part of society and its dynamics. However, Her role as public intellectual is not simply on account of professional expertise, but because of a personal commitment to an ideal of truth that serves society. There is an important distinction here between a public intellectual who does not aim to please power or even society, and a self-promoting populist or an expert in the service of power, or even between a public servant and a public intellectual. In fact, according to a recent study entitled Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know? A very thorough study, exhaustive study. Most experts perform worse in their forecasting of societal trends and political outcomes than if they simply assign random outcomes to their predictions. So, this culture of experts has proven to be ineffective and problematic. To be sure, it is not easy to draw clear boundaries on the issues of public engagement and expert knowledge. And there are degrees or levels of public engagement. The first level is presenting specialized knowledge within one's discipline to the public. Explain to a general public, for example, the idea of gravitational waves, that's to quote just a recent example, or the crash of the financial markets. The second level is drawing on one's discipline to explain matters that relate to the social, cultural, or political world. For example, draw on sociology or anthropology of science in discussions of creationism. I use the example because I work on it. Linguistic analysis of political or ideological discourse to deconstruct this discourse, and more generally deconstructing the claims of science, or alternatively using science to deconstruct power relations. Then the third level, which is by invitation only, and not on account of occupying positions of authority, whether in government or administration or what have you, but quite the opposite, on account of questioning power relations. This level applies to those who become public personas by virtue of the quality and impact of their intellectual work. Public intellectuals of this type often speak about subjects beyond their areas of expertise. But when we, normal academics, do this, we are easily dismissed for talking about things outside our academic expertise, even when we slightly cross the boundaries of disciplines. I mean, just think how often we do this to our colleagues who don't fit our narrow disciplinary definitions, no matter that some of the most original work comes from such academics. I mean, we are very ready to dismiss someone, oh, he's not a real political scientist, or, he really doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a real social scientist, a sociologist, or what have you. Of course, there is a higher responsibility as one draws on a deep wealth of knowledge and experience, and then improvise. And an intellectual who finds herself in this position should be careful not to improvise lightly. Yet, irrespective of these important nuances, what is clear is that not any type of reflective academic activity qualify as an intellectual exercise, and there is a qualitative threshold that one needs to cross for such qualification. And a public intellectual is not a self-identification. Rather, it is a recognition by the public of an intellectual's ability to influence and change. And this ability to influence is rooted first and foremost in knowledge. Hence, the need to treat this trust with responsibility and to constantly be aware of the limitations of knowledge and self. Other questions remain. One, related to the public in public intellectual, is whether a public intellectual has to adjust her style of writing to target a general public. Or could the functions be achieved through systematic critical analysis, which leads to the production of new knowledge that is only addressed to a small group of experts or scholars within a field of study? And related to this point is the question of what constitutes a public, real or virtual. Is it a requirement that a public intellectual be read or listened to by a general public? And is there a meaning in critical and social relevant scholarship that does not communicate, does not have an audience, let alone impact? Is it sufficient to work for the public good, even if not directly addressing the public? And more broadly, is there a process of thinking that is required, or is it simply deploying common knowledge to answer questions of interest to the public? But why bother? As Raymond Williams noted in Keywords, until the middle 20th century, unfavorable uses of intellectualism, and intelligentsia were dominant in English, and it's clear that such uses persist. William describes a mode of anti-intellectualism, but even today, many academics are reluctant to accept the label because of its elitist connotations and the images it conjures of elites assaulting the public from their literally intellectual salons. And there is indeed something pretentious about the term. But that may also be because we live in a political and cultural environment that rewards conformity and marginalizes dissent. Another more pertinent reason for the reluctance by academics to take on the role of public intellectuals is that within the rigid rules of academic institutions, anyone who engages in public debate is at risk of being considered a less serious scholar who seeks self-promotion and personal aggrandizement at the expense of serious research. It's hard to tell when this is indeed the case or when this is an allegation by fellow academics who failed to take on the challenge of public engagement, but be that as it may, these are very serious concerns and from the perspective of academics themselves. In his much discussed and otherwise anti-intellectual 2001 book, Public Intellectuals: A Study of Decline, Richard Posner argues that it's not a good book, by the way, but there are some interesting insights. I mean, it's a famous book. Richard Posner argues that public intellectualism in the United States has deteriorated due to academic over-specialization, speaking to an insular community of experts, and due to lack of accountability. Intellectuals, he says, do not pay a price for their mistakes, while academics do. In Posner's words, academics tend to think of themselves as being on holiday when they are writing for the general public. And worse still, public intellectuals with sectarian and ideological loyalties are often complacent in the ideological movements that often contribute to the rising social violence, ripping our societies apart. I mean, look at the army of cheerleading experts. Every time I watch TV, it's very hard to get news. Every time I watch TV, there is this reference to Kabir al-Khubara في معهد Washington or what have you, on all media outlets, who basically are pouring oil on sectarian strife and so on. There is this, idealization of experts, and the role that they play is certainly extremely problematic. So why do it? At the most basic, visceral level, because we have little kids and are concerned about their future. And if you're not concerned, you should be. But by default, we are all naturally inclined to shelter our lives from the problems surrounding us. But in more than one way, it is clear that the idea of a university as a protective shell is an illusion. We academics no longer can afford the privilege of complacency. Moreover, when academics withdraw from the public space, they relegate the conversation about the public good to quote-unquote experts with strong vested interests. And this has dire consequences to everyone, including the academics themselves. Today, more than ever before, a sense of crisis permeates all aspects of our lives, in politics and government, in terms of the infrastructure, resources, energy, food, water, in terms of viable economies, in health and environment, in education and culture, and in the very fabric of our social and civil lives. All, by the way, are topics which we can cover in our research, and some of us do. Our societies are overwhelmed with endemic poverty, instability, and marginalization. And there are no easy solutions for any of these structural problems, problems that need to be addressed systematically, not just through political interventions, but also through reflective scholarly interventions that inform and are organically connected to social action. Today, ordinary citizens must choose to submit to monstrous orders imposed on them that force them to watch, in fact, participate in killing their next-door neighbors who have lived with them all their lives. Today, the very value systems we often take for granted are in flux, requiring intellectual choices from everyone, but especially from those of us who have the luxury to think. But if these are not sufficient motivations, the changing landscape of higher education offers additional incentives to rethink the system. In the report of a joint survey conducted in 2010 by Public Agenda and the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, it has a funny title. The title is Squeeze Play 2010, Continuing Public Anxiety on Cost, Harsher Judgments on How Colleges Are Run. In this report, 60% of survey respondents said that they believe colleges and universities value their financial strength more than the educational experiences of students. But an even more universal concern expressed in many studies by funders and parents and students, just as it is expressed by university administrators and trustees, this concern relates to the increasing cost of higher education, the massive debt accumulated by higher education institutions, as well as by graduating students, and the dwindling resources available to subsidize higher education. And so far, the proposed solutions to this problem these problems are to diversify revenue streams, for example, focus on service education, incubation, executive and continuing education, and so on, enlarge the endowment, increase the endowment. But these solutions work only for a small number of elite universities and do not offer solutions to the majority of institutions of higher education. One of the direct results of what some refer to as the crisis of higher education or the higher education bubble has been a persistent demand by parents and students and also by government and industry funders, persistent demand on outcomes and accountability. And this is as true of the United States as it is of, for example, Qatar, which is investing highly in education, and of institutions of higher education across the board, in Europe, everywhere. Everywhere we look, we see this focus on outcomes and accountability. It is sort of contagious. There is, as we speak, an ongoing struggle between a coalition of the U.S. accrediting agencies, all of them together, in the US and the Department of Education over this very issue. And accreditors had to make serious concessions to meet the demands imposed by the Department of Education in the US related to outcomes and accountability. For example, developing a college rating plan and a revamped college scorecard and developing college access plans and so on and so forth. I mean, it's still early to see where all of this will lead, but this is a very serious sort of struggle currently happening in the US. And of course, it spills over elsewhere. These are, by the way, the accrediting agencies that accredit us, that accredit so many different institutions in the region and so on. Of course, it's not immediately evident what the words outcomes and accountability mean. But the dominant trend is an instrumental understanding of the terms with focus on professional achievements and performance in standardized tests. Focus on cost of education, focus on the cost of education, measured against the value of education, focus on student employability, and the demand for universities and academics to demonstrate the societal value of what they do. There are therefore many reasons for universities and academics to be socially engaged. And the motivation behind engagement is neither pure self-denial and sacrifice, nor is it simply self-interest. But what does this mean in the context of institutions of higher education as we know them today? There are numerous studies that illustrate a low level of societal engagement among academics. But this deficiency is not necessarily because academics do not care. Rather, it's often because there are no adequate structures for supporting and streamlining such engagement. Key here is to offer academics the freedom to care about the outside world, to step out of one's closed shell, whether it's the constraints of a discipline or the promotion file, and to take risks. The intellectual and the public intellectual hinges on the freedom to seek knowledge. But this freedom is in reality constrained by a number of factors. First, the defined job role, job description. If your senior colleagues don't like you, they can often say at promotion time, you were hired to do X, not Y, so therefore we will not promote you. Promotion requirements and the need to write on topics that will be published in high-impact journals that usually favor the mainstream. The tension here is between sufficient originality to merit publishing and not too much originality that will make the contributions unrecognizable within the mainstream of the discipline and its journals. This is the issue of performance measurements and metrics, the impact factor, citations, and so on. And third, restrictions on research funding and prioritization by funding agencies and by extension by institutions. Of course, competitiveness is not bad. But the problem is that funding restrictions can have a negative impact on academic freedom, and the research agenda of the academic public intellectual cannot be exclusively driven by the availability of funding. Furthermore, the institutional culture of measuring performance can often be limiting of the effort to question the assumptions of disciplines against which the new knowledge is assessed. So to ensure the integrity of purpose of academic work in general, and more specifically of the work of public intellectuals, performance measurements must remain tools and facilitators, not ends in themselves, and engaged scholars should not engage in intellectual exercises to score against these tools, but to pursue truth and to question common assumptions. At the same time, universities need validating mechanisms to ensure the quality of the contributions of individual scholars, to draw the line between engagement and mediocrity, between public intellectuals and populists. And as members of a professional group, the legitimacy of academics derives from within the institutions in which they work and the communities of interest to which they belong. Clearly then, there is a tension between belonging to a community of knowledge, using its standards and being judged by these standards on the one hand, and providing a critical dissenting perspective on disciplines and on social and political matters. But engaged scholarship is not and cannot be about making intellectual compromises or concessions in the quality of scholarship. Rather, it's simply intellectual work that intentionally aims to produce a public good. It is about making scholarship better and more relevant. In fact, numerous studies demonstrate that one comes out better informed through engagement, and that we can shape and transform our opinions through what the literature calls communicative rationality. And still, there is no doubt that the institutional cultures of most traditional universities are not supportive of engaged scholarship, let alone academics who assume the role of public intellectual. Of course, tenure affords academics the freedom to take on the larger and harder task of engaging the public. But the impediments I discussed so far are all in universities that have the tenure system. So tenure on its own is not a solution. So the institutional challenges persist. In fact, numerous universities recognize these challenges and they are dedicating great efforts. There are some national task forces, including many universities, to create more flexible frameworks for valuing and evaluating academic public engagement. In addition to compelling external factors, these universities recognize that engagement enhances the profile and impact of universities and therefore increases the potential for mobilizing support. Engagement also illustrates an institution's commitment to its communities, and this connection is becoming increasingly more and more essential for the future survival of institutions. And engagement also recasts the primary objective of an institution as one of problem solving. It's the last page, Huda. And engagement also recasts the primary objective of an institution as one of problem solving through interdisciplinary academic training and research that transcends the boundaries of the traditional disciplines. Of course, a real institutional commitment to engaged scholarship cannot be achieved through the establishment of a couple of offices and outreach programs. Such commitment requires, among other things, an articulation of a mission and a vision in which improving the life of communities is at the heart of the institution's mission, not just as lip service, but a real, it has to be woven into the mission and vision of an institution. It also requires an institutional recognition of engaged scholarship, not just symbolically, but in terms of tangible reward systems and incentives. Institutions must also develop strategies to partner with communities and to support research and service that enhances their lives. Also central to this effort is that it is not random and disjointed, but translates into an institutional consensus over the most effective engagement strategies, what issues to focus on, what are the most urgent challenges. In our case, here at this institution, or in Lebanon, the recent upheavals in the region suggest some obvious research agendas. In addition, one can think of critical research programs in health, both in medicine and health policies, urban planning, environment, environmental studies, energy, food and water, infrastructure, governance, culture, and civil society and citizenship. But ultimately, beyond all of these institutional incentives, the decision to engage derives first from a deep personal commitment. Hence, Edward Said's characterizations of the public intellectual as exile and marginal, as amateur, and as the author of a language that tries to speak truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. We move now to Bassam.
Thank you, Dr. Zray. I'm very happy to be the person who is uh, concluding, because I am actually going to say that I know that you are, or I am, the last thing between you and freedom today. And I realize that my friend and colleague and mentor in some ways, Ahmed, has taken up a little bit extra time, and I'm also aware that we need to talk. So I've kind of reorganized what I'm presenting to make it a little shorter. I will address the highlights. Islam. I will address the highlights of the paper in progress, and will present, if time allows, a quick project, or a project quickly, that exemplifies one way to engage in publicly engaged scholarship, although I do not think we'll have the time for that. The topic of this conference is vast and perhaps unruly. This panel on publicly engaged scholarship narrows things down a bit, but actually not by much. My presentation focuses on context, opportunities, and limits within which publicly engaged scholarship might take place. And it will be a little different than a lot of the other presentations, as it will look at the broader context. I will naturally reiterate some points that have been shared earlier in the conference, or some points I shared in my opening statement, but we'll keep the discussion at a broad level within the presentation, and I hope we can go to the details in the Q&A. For instance, at some risk, I will not be distinguishing between private and public universities or between different locales unless it is of prominent significance. And clearly, not all commentary applies to all universities. AUB is different from Duke University in some ways, and both are different from a university in rural Egypt or Yemen. As far as location, it is tricky. It's actually quite tricky. While one should not erect rigid boundaries that reproduce a depoliticized distinction between East and West and terms of the sort, we sometimes do have distinct contexts in which free and critical thought and production is simply not possible or not advisable. I need not provide examples, I assume. Suffice it to say that we should not make too much of these distinctions between locales, even if we are aware of them, especially during the current period where things and processes are growing increasingly alike in most of the countries we come from or are discussing, as processes that reflect a sustained pressure on what can be called a global political economic order, coming from that old cliche, the power of the people, the public, and so on, are happening nearly everywhere. I start with the timing of the conference, which is opportune, and address the first concern, which is context. Opportunities and limits. I'm going to start with context. And here I'm referring to more global factors than regional ones, such as the Arab uprisings, for instance. I'm not addressing those, which is a good case study in all cases, the Arab uprisings, that is, of tremendous failure in terms of publicly engaged scholarship or knowledge production. The context in which we find ourselves today, globally and locally, is not just another factor. And it hasn't been discussed sufficiently, largely because we actually had really good papers on specific topics. Despite variations that we can parse out endlessly, today we are facing a sort of global assault on what universities have come to stand for from both state and market. I use the word assault because it is fitting. It is fitting not in the sense that you can feel or witness it at every point. On the contrary, this characterization may sound a bit off or exaggerated for many participants in the university system, globally and locally, precisely because it is not always ubiquitously evident for all, nor is it necessarily offensive for many. However, I use the term in a historical sense. During the past 2 decades, some say a bit more, we can witness a steady process in which market, via neoliberalism, in quotation marks, because it's become a word that is almost becoming meaningless, like the word terrorism, but it's a quick reference. So we can witness a steady process in which market via neoliberalism and state via repression have been gradually transforming the university environment not only back to its elite origin, but to an instrument for the reversal of progress in the service of elite networks, exclusionary markets, and brutal stability. Here, I will skip a bit of the text, and I hope I can unpack things in the Q&A or in the final paper. This transformation must necessarily be violent going forward. I'll try to explain why. Exclusion in former periods was a norm, a feature of the liberal state, the colonial state, in mostly agrarian societies or liberal elite-dominated societies. Today, exclusion has to contend with mobilized working classes and other groups who have access to instruments of power, who are often connected globally, and whose participation in the new system that is being woven is actually needed. In other words, one of the contradictions of the development of global capitalism is that it cannot endlessly prey on the local population within one's own country. In the past, colonialism provided an exit and various other adventures. Today, such ventures of empire still exist, but are steadily narrowing and are often producing counterproductive consequences. Notice the calls for self-isolationism and protectionism among many politicians in powerful countries. In all cases, within particular locales, you can no longer rely on the docility and utter impoverishment of excluded groups. On the other hand, you cannot rely on the sole purchasing power of the elites or on their foreign exploits. Exclusion today, even when successful, is potentially quite costly. The tentative conclusion here, which opens the door for a discussion of opportunities, is that exclusion is no longer compatible with stability, no matter how intuitive this might be as we look around us. Intuitive as in exclusion and stability seem to be compatible and intuitive, but it actually is not. Exclusion and instability will increasingly go hand in hand in most cases for more reasons than one can showcase in a short presentation. In fact, I will skip a bit here. As we can witness in increasing parts of the world during the past decade, exclusion in its economic and political varieties, an artificial distinction to be sure, has engendered violence and instability of a more enduring kind. The period after the 2008 economic crisis in the United States is a new era of sorts. The same applies to the still unfolding uprisings and counter-revolution in the Arab world. We can also point to other cases such as Greece and beyond. I am not speaking of a radical and an immediate change globally, but about different modes of dealing with crisis, with very different trade-offs that themselves provide opportunities for publicly engaged scholarship and knowledge production. Paradoxically, the powers that be within various locales or countries are stuck. And one can look at different case studies and countries to actually ascertain this process. On the one hand, they have no repertoire of groups left to exclude locally, more or less, and not in the same way this has been done in the past century, let's say. On the other hand, they are unwilling to offer real and meaningful inclusion. Thus, there seems to be a few alternative courses of action for the elite at the global and local political economic levels. The first course of action refers to creative forms of exclusion, and we can talk about that. The second is further repression, subtle and not so subtle. And the third is ideological maneuvering, especially within hegemonic systems, because ideological maneuvering in other places, like in the region, is not going to work extremely well in most cases, not in all cases. The opportunities ahead for publicly engaged scholarship amid increasing commodification and repression lie in the fact that any and all of these courses of action, which we are seeing unfold before our eyes here and abroad, are producing further instability. This is reinforcing a more stringent application of the aforementioned alternatives, leading to the eruption of more islands and modes of violence and a sense of ubiquitous instability, which has actually begun for some time now to reach countries that were historically stable. In more directly repressive states, this is further stripping the state of any modicum of legitimacy and creating opportunities for medium and long-term mobilization that will reproduce what we have witnessed during the Arab uprisings, whether or not some of us feel or opine that counter-revolutions have triumphed. I simply do not disagree. I do not agree that this is a terminal victory for counter-revolution, even in the medium run, but that's a different issue altogether. In more liberal contexts, such as the United States, liberal, the loaded word, a strained term to be sure, this increase of violence to restore stability has begun in the past decade to chip seriously at whatever notion of hegemony that existed in these contexts. In the absence of hegemony, which is itself a complex term, or as it breaks down, the role and effectiveness of ideology, the third course of action mentioned above, is diminishing considerably. And that opens the door for a lot of opportunities. This outcome presents vast opportunities for academic engagement. It is here where academics who wish to have an impact on the public need to be sober and strategic in terms of both collective action and long-term planning and thinking. In such environments, the doors that used to be closed, the ears that used to be clogged, and the horizons that used to be blocked all begin to open up, even if slowly. These sorts of emerging opportunities are not to be belittled, even as they seem modest. They are also not to be exaggerated. Hence, the importance of thinking collectively and strategically. And here, there's a lot to say on various contexts in various countries and various modes. Okay. This brings me to the third point, which is limitations. University environments are conducive to critical thinking, networking, and mobilization. We would be foolish to not recognize the limits of such environments and thus the limits of publicly engaged scholarship at once, as much as we would like to push those and as much as we've talked about them. If we, in my view, do not recognize the limits, we would simply be using the wrong tool for the wrong thing. It is also foolish, even unproductive, to ask too much of intellectuals sometimes, while it is somewhat cowardly to expect that we have no power or role in the public realm, even if in more repressing environments where the odds are stacked against intellectuals or scholars. We should not expect the university environment to be the arena where we both start and finish. On the contrary, part and parcel of the productive limits I am referring to is to recognize when, where, and how to hand over the baton or task to other forces, spaces, groups, parties, movements, and/or environments, because the alternatives differ in different contexts. It is the peculiarities of these limits or thresholds that I think should be discussed further depending on context, not their actual existence, because they do exist. There are no contexts within which publicly engaged scholarship is unbounded. There is a time and place for everything, but those who never identify a time to fight hard or go to war, so to speak, in certain contexts, or shy away from any disruption even when the context calls for it, are rather cowardly, and it's okay to use such terms. By the same token, those who simply want to raise their voice and lash out prematurely or constantly at the system, whatever that is, are naive and essentially not effective and could be counterproductive. I'll share why this is significant. Absent the power of ideological maneuvering by dominant cultures, states, and elites, it is this kind of unproductive incitement on part of some otherwise progressive forces that is used as fodder to mobilize the mob against real change. This is also another topic to address in detail. My aim here is not a blueprint for public engagement. Rather, it is to recognize the broader contours within which such engagement might take place and to maximize the effect of public engagement based on carefully knitted and examined case studies. In downtimes, that is, in times when more intense public engagement is not possible or productive, we academics can do so much within our environments to build movements and establish the grounds for mobilization, action, and further publicly meaningful knowledge production. And in that sense, we could talk about various kinds of projects, various kinds of collaborations, various kinds of network building that can take place, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Bassam. We open now for discussion, and I hope that the speakers would also speak directly and use little time in asking their questions, I hope. Okay, I'm taking names, yes?
Hi, Lara Halabi. I want to ask Dr. Patrick, when you spoke about the autonomy of the university, and you make allusion also to the monarchist regime, the EUB in the monarchist regime, for example, and the EUB in Lebanon. There is a big space for more freedom in Lebanon, political freedom or other. But I wanted to know how much the formula or the political regime had an impact on the interior policy of the AUB. For example, I will take in the Lebanese university, there is a certain policy to make an equilibrium, to make between religion. يعني they will make an employment 6/6. يعني the employment on the basis of six Muslims, 6 Christian. I don't know if this has the same impact in the AUB. Is there any other impacts from the elite? Because the political elite in Lebanon is the same as the corporation elite, because they are maintaining the power over all the corporation. Yani we spoke about the same power when you speak corporation and the political regime. So how much is this impacted the American university, the policy of the American university?
Thank you so much. I think I need time to digest the 3 excellent talks. Ahmed, I like so much how you started your talk about to add the critical thinking as inherent side of being public intellectual. And but then I found that I didn't really follow your talk because you fell in the trap of many literature we find in the Arab world about Arab intellectual, where it's your talk, you lump sum so much this category, and we feel that this category should be unpacked. For instance, do you think of centrality of academia as a driver to public intellectual? What do you think, for instance, about a South African model where civil society produce so much intellectual? I mean, even NGOs. I'm not talking about private research center. What about Iran, for instance? Iran is amazing debate, critical debate come from preacher of mosque. So it's and in conversation with people in academia. I mean, and some of these preachers are part of the academia, and some. I think we need. I mean, just my comment, questions is to say we need really to unpack this category. Otherwise, it become like tart at a cream, and we cannot follow. Etc. The second and last point. As one word for Bassam, I think Arab intellectuals play major role in these Arab uprisings. I mean, we have very interesting case studies about Tunisia, about Egypt. If we see the mass of people who went into prison nowadays in the time of Sisi, it means, I am talking about professors, okay? It means that there is people speaking up, etc. So I think it's, I mean, to lump sum to say, no, this is, I mean, because it was this slogan that Arab uprising without intellect, etc. It's not true. I mean, really, it's, I feel it's a little bit self-flagellation. Oh, okay. Patrick, thank you so much about this last idea you brought, that in fact, the campus is so fragile that needs to do an alliance with off-campus, I mean, forces. I mean, I think this is a central point. But off-campus forces should not be simply instrumentalized. I mean, brought to alliance in the last minute. I mean, this university should do a work from A to Z. We should, those forces should be taught in our textbooks. We should brought them to our talks, conferences, etc., in order that to have an alliance. In the last 1 month, I spent so much time to have alliance outside of OUB about the work permit and our racist ministry of itself. And I am so disappointed. Not disappointed. They told me, why we have a strike, we in Lebanese university. You never show solidarity with us. Why now, only when you have a trouble with the minister, that you come to ask us help? So I think really we should think, radically our relationship to Lebanese society and Arab society. Thank
you. Yes, we have the speaker, and then Aline.
Thank you. So first, briefly, I want to just say I really found all three of these papers compelling. I have a question for Ahmed. I noticed it seems that maybe you somewhat were conflating the views of intellectuals put forth by Gramsci and Said, and there is, of course, a considerable overlap between the two. Yet at the same time, I think there are important differences in the sense that Gramsci's conception of the intellectual as a relative sort of instrument in communist revolution differs from Said, who on the one hand does advocate clear political stances for intellectuals, but also I think has some loyalty to a more liberal notion of intellectuals as sort of deeply suspicious of any ideology, including something like Gramsci's Marxism. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that tension and whether you agree that it exists, and also if you agree that there is this tension between the two, which do you think is a more suitable role for public intellectuals?
Aline?
I want to ask Patrick, and maybe Ahmed can fill in, about the AUB open and free campus, or, I mean, institution. Do you think that within this context, the reality is able to produce the public intellectuals that the 70s was able to produce? Because if you're saying that it's open and free, I want to see what kind of components are still maintained. And if, especially that, based on my limited knowledge, that the student body is a different body. So, I mean, it has changed, of course, shifted geographically, maybe, due to the different boundaries and problems. but can it still be able to, produce the dynamics, the political dynamics that has been historically in the 70s mainly? Just wondering,
Thank you. One more speaker and then two more speakers, and then we'll give the round. And
Great. Thank you for a great panel. I'm Alan Sears, and I just wanted to ask everyone, we tend to often use the term intellectuals in this kind of discussion as if that were people with a certain kind of formal education, in other words, officially certified intellectuals. And it seems to me that, for example, in the work of Gramsci and elsewhere, there's an emphasis on intellectuals as activists, not marked by formal education, but by what they've learned through the struggle in various ways, and they may or may not have formal education. And I'm wondering whether part of the role of public intellectuals in the academic sense in this context, the times that we're in right now, is not in fact primarily learning from movements by participating in them rather than standing apart and commenting.
Rabal?
Thank you. I actually have also a question for Patrick, and I would also like to hear Ahmed's also response to that, because you're both at AUB. And I'm asking about the commons, the question of the commons. This is just like a Habermas public sphere and so on. People do not enter the commons from the same place, and they do not sit at the commons in the same equal place. So when you talk about the commons, it's sort of like a very broad concept that sounds really great, but then even we know at the AUB, people who come to the same commons of the AUB, whether it is the cats or whether the people who clean or whether it is the professors and the deans and the president and so on, everybody has a different space and the citizenship and so on and so forth. So and that's kind of like one thing, if you can elaborate on that a little bit more. I'm a bit troubled by kind of like how beautiful this concept is. So I want to trouble it a little bit more. But the other thing I'm also concerned about this, sort of like, I know you talked about it, but I think it's a big tendency in a lot of our research, and I say a lot of intellectuals who are concerned about change in the Arab world. A lot of the times we're taking for granted that something like a Lebanese context or the AUB is somewhat becomes much more open and so on, and then it's easier to accept that the Gulf becomes a much more oppressive space. And I think there is some kind of a bias already inherent, and I'm not talking about the value-free bias, but there is something about sort of like the notion in the Arab world of sort of like civilizational hierarchy. And I think people know what I'm talking about. I don't want to take too much time. I can speak. The other question I have for maybe Bassam, you can talk about, because you mentioned that the economics of publishing, the political economy of that, and the question of the value of them, because you alluded to it and you said you will be able to elaborate. Of publishing, of the value of, we talked about it a little bit earlier in the earlier session, and you mentioned a little in your talk about and we talked about the linguistic imperialism and so on, this is the last session. If you can just discuss a little bit, being in the Arab Studies Institute, and how do we get beyond this whole question of publishing in English and the value, and in the sense of being actively involved in changing society? Thank you.
Can I see a show of hands of how many want to speak? Because there's one more question, and anybody else has 2 more. 2 more?
I just have an urgent technical point I just need to raise. We're grateful for our videographer for staying beyond the contractual request, but we have to extend a warm applause to our translators. We kept them here for... We kept them here yesterday for an extra 45 minutes, and today they are bound by other obligations to leave us at 4. So we apologize, but in a few minutes we will lose our instantaneous translation. But we're also fortunate to have with us a student who has graciously provided her own services. So Ola will be providing instantaneous translation to whomever needs it. And I'm just looking at whoever still has the headphones on. So just to let you all know. just wanted to throw that.
And also, I would like to acknowledge the people who have been tweeting this conference and making it globally available prominently. Noor Juda and Tariq Aradi, thank you so much for being so diligent.
Let's take these two questions, yes please, and then Setine.
Thank you so much for your talks. I have somewhat of a theoretical question, and it is sort of inspired by a branch of literature that a few of us have cited in this conference so far, and that's critical Black studies, which holds terms like public and commons in question, in part because of the very nature of what is excluded from these terms. In the United States context, this is, of course, the Black slave, in addition to non-human nature, in addition to other geological forces, I think, that we don't often count as human. And I don't really have a clear sense, and it's certainly not my place to think about what those exclusions could look like in this context. But I would be interested in extending, Ahmed, your question of what the public is, to really think about then what doesn't it include? And the same question with the commons, kind of building off of Rabab's question. Okay, so the commons, we think we know what it is, and it always implies an uncommons. And so what is that? And this is a theoretical question, so if there isn't an answer, that's great, but I would like to raise the point that, yeah, there's always an exclusion there.
A very short question, not question, but comment really, and it follows some of what Rabab and Eileen and others, and some people mentioned yesterday and brought up in the past 2 days. One of which is, I mean, the point is, I don't think we can have as our starting point the idea that the university is autonomous. I mean, that's an ideal, perhaps, that some put forth as what the university should be, and not all people in universities think the university should be autonomous, but also that in many places, and this is where we don't have enough empirical studies, and we don't really know, we haven't studied the university from this kind of perspective. But speaking as someone who spent 14 years at a Jordanian university, the university was very much part of the state domain. You couldn't talk about the university outside the state. And in fact, the ambitions of publicly engaged intellectuals at Jordanian universities was to become ministers and to become public officials. And, you know, and we know this from all around the world, that there's a revolving door between universities and states, state functionaries. And so that's not something that was particular to Jordan by any means, but that a university position was seen as a stepping stone or stepping stone, whatever, up the ladder into public office at a high level. In fact, the first term, the first phrase I learned when I went to Yarmouk University was Ustaz Mustawzir. You know, anybody who was very active on TV, organizing conferences and so on, they used to say, Hada Ustaz Mustawzir, you know, wants to become a wazir. Mustawzir. So it took me. So there, in fact, was a native category. There was a native category for this kind of public intellectual. And the aim was not engagement with society necessarily. It wasn't public good as we are defining it. Here, it was a different kind of public good that people had in mind. So the way in which the university itself can be part of the state domain, the way in which power within the university translates into power outside the university, and so on. I think I recognize everything you said, and you know, agree with it. But there's another dimension as well, with very similar mechanisms and similar channels and similar activities and so on, but with very different aims. And the other point I just wanted to sort of throw out there is the idea that a public intellectual creates his or her own public. Publics are not, I agree with you, we need to think about what is the public and what are publics and what are counter-publics and so on, but I think part of the role of a public intellectual is to create a public where none existed before. Feminism, of course, I think is the best example for that, but there are other kinds of movements that we can think of where a public emerges. as a result of intellectual activity. So, thank you.
All right. Yeah, why don't you start, Patrick?
Okay, I'll be very brief. Lara's question, of course AUB is part of Lebanon and it's subject to the same kinds of pressures as other places, and it has changed through time a great deal. And as you know, the power of different sectarian groups has waned and waxed in various ways, and AUB is buffeted by these changes. There's no doubt about it. There's an attempt, and perhaps AUB has more ability than some other entities, to shield itself and to attempt to be somewhat neutral. I mean, compared to some Lebanese campuses, we have a representation of faculty, staff, and students that mirrors the demographics of the country more, but there's no sense in which we are separate or completely outside of the society. Sorry, I completely agree with you about these existing movements and other groups outside the campus, and I think it's I don't have anything really to add to that. The questions about the commons from Rabab and others. It is. I mean, I understand that the public sphere, certainly the way it is spoken about in the United States, there was a kind of entry cost for the public sphere. The public sphere is meant for people who are seen as rational, people who are seen as unmarked. No doubt. I mean, in other words, yes, African Americans are considered marked, and so. I think that the idea that it's sort of this natural open space where everybody has access to it is, of course, an illusion. Now, I wanted to use it in the university to speak of the commons of the university in a more particular way. That is that the conversations within disciplines, for instance, about how knowledge is debated and how knowledge is verified and how it moves forward always involves a kind of conversation that implies a kind of openness. And of course it's an idealized idea. It's fraught with all kinds of similar issues, but my idea is that this kind of conversation is what is at the heart of academic research, but also should be at the heart of education. In other words, if we are encouraging questioning, and if we're encouraging this kind of openness, then this is the exact kind of thing that leads to raising questions about things like the public sphere. In other words, everything is questionable. That's what I mean by this, and but I understand that the term is fraught. Maybe I should think of another way of putting this. I'm not sure. I agree with you, Satani, about the history of universities. It's an illusion to think universities were ever autonomous. They've always been subject to whatever social power relations existed at different times and places. The idea of a research university, which very specifically begins in Germany at a certain point in the Enlightenment, is, it creates this idealized idea of this pure openness, and it's never complete, and autonomy has never been complete. And however, what I'm criticizing really are those progressive intellectuals who are at universities who are upset by what they perceive as an erosion of this kind of autonomy. And I just think that it's a very weak point of view, and there is no leverage there, and that's why I'm suggesting engaging with forces outside the university.
because either I did not understand the question or it doesn't apply, so I'm not doing very much. Influence of intellectuals on the uprisings. I actually, Sari, I'm sticking to the title of the talk and the conference, which is engaged scholarships or publicly engaged scholarship, much more so than the influence of someone like you or myself or others who are connected with movements. I'm actually referring more in this discussion to how movements have been affected by actual production of knowledge and scholarships, which is kind of what we talked about in the interview that I just conducted with you, that's coming out soon, like an audio interview, whereby the scholarship itself, like the actual material, is not making its way into the public or into policy, much more so than, you know, us engaged as activists, which is something that is part of what I could expand on, but that's not what I was referring to when I talked about the tremendous failure of scholars, where the uprisings really didn't involve movements and groups, I'm talking in general, that actually gleaned something from the, you know, the production of scholars and so on. Who is an intellectual? I agree with what you're saying. I actually should say, or should have said, that when I used the word intellectual, I did mean, you know, scholars within an academic environment, much more so than just an intellectual, because you could be actually, of course, an intellectual without being, you know, a PhD. And I've seen more cases than I would like to see of actual PhDs that I do not consider. You know, I shouldn't even say finish this sentence, because the word intellectual is problematic, and it's got its own loaded meanings. And Rabab, I actually didn't. I mean, I'm really impressed that you picked something up from my talk that I wasn't aware of, which is the economics of publishing. I actually didn't mean, if I said it, I didn't mean to say it. I wasn't talking about publishing, I was talking about knowledge production in general. But if there is a discussion that you would like us to have, I'm happy to have it in terms of publishing. But I'll leave the floor to Ahmed, and we can go back to this if you insist.
Sari, I agree with you, of course. You know, my talk is about the role of public intellectuals within an academic setup, but it doesn't mean that it's restricted, as everyone else says, and there are many intellectuals elsewhere. And again, on the question of, you know, the notion that there are certified intellectuals, I agree completely, and this is certainly not the notion. Although, you know, in the case of Gramsci, ultimately political struggle is quite essential, and, you know, membership in the Communist Party and social consciousness and so on and so forth. Said and Gramsci, yeah, you're completely right. There is a very clear tension between the two. And again, this is not an analysis of either Said or of Gramsci, you know, both of whom I think, you know, Prison Notebooks is a must-read for anyone who's interested in this topic. And I think also Representations of the Intellectual is an excellent work. First of all, I mean, Said is, I think, influenced by Gramsci more than anyone else, despite the significant differences between the two. But he actually engages him, recognizes him, and is influenced by him, you know, more than any of the other people that he discusses. You know, what in terms of my presentation today, what I found interesting in Gramsci is this, you know, rather sort of egalitarian, and I paraphrased him and I applied him to academia. You know, everyone can be an intellectual. But not everyone will play the social role, and there are requirements for that. And, you know, in academia, I applied that. I sort of transferred that to academia. And Said, of course, is a bit more elitist. I think there is still value in Said's sort of elitist notion of an intellectual, if only as an ideal to aspire for, to look for, even though it's, and I think, what I try to do in my presentation is to lower the bar, talk about how we academics, if we so choose, can take on this task, this challenge. But on the other hand, I do recognize the importance of recognizing multiple gradations and an ideal of a public intellectual as a dissenter and as someone who doesn't work from within the institutions and so on. We can talk more outside this context. What's different I think there are significant differences, contextual differences in the whole region between the 60s and 70s and today. I mean, there is a level of, there is a sense of crisis which permeates our existence everywhere you look today. And, it's not to say that there is no meaningful struggle in today's world, and it's not to say that there are no causes. There are, but the forms, the expressions of struggle are much more diffused in today's world than they were in the 70s. And the 60s, in the 60s, there were very clear silos, easy to identify. There was, we believed in these silos, and there was much more, I mean, for those of us who were, old enough in the 70s and so on. So I think there is this very significant difference, and that, and the role that the university plays in the current period is certainly different from the role that it played back then. I mean, there are different roles, I think, but there are significant differences. And Rabab, of course, I agree with you completely. I mean, this idealized space. I mean, I'm not, by the way, I didn't idealize academics, and and I said very clearly, academics are not even intellectuals by definition. They may or may not be intellectuals, let alone public intellectuals. They have the opportunity, they have the possibility, and I tried to talk about challenges, internal challenges and external challenges, and institutional and structural challenges, if they choose to take on this kind of task. And I didn't idealize even the notion of the public intellectual, which is why I quoted Gramsci, because I want to talk about something, things which are possible in the realm of possibility and gradations and so on. And there is a lot that can be done, but it's not automatic. It's not automatic that the academics are intellectual. There are actually many and they tend to be very articulate, many anti-intellectual academics. And they articulate anti-intellectualisms in so many different ways. I mean, most of the expressions of articulate anti-intellectual articulations come from academics, actually. They're the ones who tend to make a case of anti-intellectualism. But I agree with you, there is no idealized, I'm not idealizing either academics or the academic spaces in which we operate. And I think it's a big mistake to idealize. But on the other hand, I think one can realistically think of possibilities within the various spaces that we occupy. And they are very, real possibilities. I mean, this is what I'm interested in my talk. On the question of I agree with you completely, but again, I don't know how it's a theoretical question. Of course, who's included, and we're talking about a particular realm with people who are identified in so many different ways. It's a very structured. By the way, academia is very conservative. It's it's one of the most academic institutions are amongst the most conservative institutions in the world. They're slow moving, they're still changing, and so on. But we're talking about also an insular world, and there are many people and whatever who are not even there, who are not in that space. But I need to think a little more about. But I agree with you. At least your initial comments. We tend to speak a lot here at AUB about how many prime ministers we graduated, and which isn't always something to be proud of, by the way. But I agree with you. It's about power and access to power, and which is why I talked about this culture of experts. I mean, and the challenges, I think today. The challenges for academics in terms of being able to take up this type of role, if even it's public intellectual with small p and small I, not the big public intellectuals, the challenges are much bigger. Partly because we're called on to be experts, and most of the experts that are called on to participate in various forums or whatever, in fact, perpetuate structural inequities. They don't actually challenge them. I mean, you know, in so many different ways, we are accomplices. But it's not. This isn't to say that there are no I think there are possibilities, but which is why I ended on this note. Which is why I would like to keep Gramsci and Said. You know, this personal choice, I think, is quite essential. You know, it's not just a structural thing, but it's, you know, there is a personal element there, and I think it's you know, we have the option, we have the luxury. There are institutional obstacles in the face of performing this role. There are also personal obstacles and so on, but there are possibilities, and I tried to sort of talk about, you know, how to sort of negotiate these internal and external challenges to taking up this role. And yes, you know, you're right. Many public intellectuals create their publics. I agree completely. I mean, it's a dialectical sort of relationship. You create the public, but then you have to be recognized by the public that you create. And I agree.
I would like to end this session by thanking the speakers for their rich contributions, their presentations, and their response to questions, and thank you all for your questions. And I would like to move to Rania and Bassam and Fatih to close the conference. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll start with some logistical notes and then go just to a few comments. People have already been asking me about this, and I just want to assure everybody that yes, the emails and contact information of all the speakers and all the attendants will be shared, so we will have an opportunity to remain in contact with each other and to hopefully empower the networking that we've already done over the past 3 days. Those of you clearly who already have papers that you've presented, we would appreciate if you could be sending us along those papers, and the others we will be contacting you later on. We're also very honored to have rapporteur who will be not only, he will go beyond summarizing the conference, but actually assessing and providing some understanding of the main issues that were presented and the main challenges that we faced. And so once that analysis is through, which Mahmoud Haidar and his graduate students are working on, then we will also be sharing that with you. Given that, my own personal comments for the conference are as follows. I think it has been very rich, the topics that have been raised and the challenges that have been presented. So here's my own subjective interpretation of it. I kept thinking throughout the 3 days of the presentation that Alan Sears presented in the second panel of the day, and I want to go back and bring up the recommendations that Alan Sears had raised as to how we can collectively empower ourselves. And he talked about the need for a transformative inclusion, the need to decolonize our disciplines, the need to have real democracy in our university where we're able to transform, hopefully, our students from customers into real democratic participants. And of course, and this is my own personal stress, the need for all of us, students, staff, and faculty, and administration, to be working to be providing good conditions for everybody on campus. We tend to overlook the staff, and it's my own personal disappointment that no one here over the past 3 days actually brought up research assistants and graduate students, particularly as labor, and how could we be working to empower the conditions for all, including the non-academic staff. With that, I would like to raise a big question that I hope that we can be developing in the future, which is, again, what kind of a university system do we want? What is the vision that we hope to create to go beyond simply recognizing and challenging the current modes that we are trying to overcome, to actually trying to envision what is that ideal university that we want, what is that ideal pedagogical system that we want, both within the classroom, both with regards to the power structures in the academic institutions, and of course with regards to the relationship between academia and the social justice that we strive to have outside of the university and not simply within the university. And lastly, what I would like to be raising is how we can be taking this discussion forward. The same question that we raised in the evaluation form, which is, what would you all like for us as the two institutes, the Asfari Institute and the Arab Studies Institute, to be doing to complement the work that we've done so far over the past 3 days? We've managed to raise critical questions. We're nowhere near to be raising the necessary answers, nor nowhere near to actually be doing the transformative work that many of us believe in. So I very much look forward to receiving your evaluation forms and to be receiving your suggestions as to how we can be building upon the work that we've already done over these past 3 days. With that, I give the floor to Fateh or to Bassam, who will then be taking this discussion forward.
I'll just say a couple of things about following up with the participants going forward. In every one of these conferences, we actually build a sort of a behind the scenes, well, now it's not behind the scenes because I'm on camera, website, in which we, for those who actually intend to, or for those interested, would be able to communicate with everyone else. It also serves as a cumulative network building tool, whereby its impact will actually become more and more visible with time, much more so than right this moment. And we will use this website to communicate, to provide the papers that have been submitted, always with the permission of people who have written them. It will also be a place where we can provide the audio, also based on the permission of the people who have spoken. And we will be publishing, also per the permission of people who have spoken. We will be publishing the audio in the Status Al-Wada audio journal at statushour.com. After we consult with you and clean up the audio as basically the proceedings of the conference, which we've published, for instance, last year. And it was a really remarkable thing because the circulation, the engagement was just remarkable and allows these talks to actually have a long shelf life. But most importantly, more importantly than, in my view, than all of this, we really would like to curate these talks and presentations and essays and papers as different sorts of publications, either as essays, roundtables, or working papers for various reasons, including potentially, if people are interested and are willing to do the additional work, to submit some of these papers if they are produced as such, as peer-reviewed or papers for peer-reviewed journals. So to make a long story short, you will be receiving an email in which all of this is included, and the information on the for the website will be included, and the request with a little bit of a kind of a push and very gentle, يعني هيك يعني ناعم, arm twisting to actually get us the papers before Palestine is liberated. Yeah.
Well, between what Rania said and what Bassam said, there's actually very little left for me to say other than to thank you all for 3 intense days of very interesting and very thought-provoking discussions. Certainly the topic and the issue, we thought we would narrow down a bit from what we did last year on an agenda for active citizenship. Turns out the topic of academia and social justice is even more complex and more far-ranging than you could possibly imagine. There are a lot of different elements of it. It's all a lot about our role, our place in society, the place of the different layers of the university, within the university and with society, and it's all about being part of a movement towards change, towards a better world. And to me, thank you all very, very much for this time, for the way that you've intersected all of the topics and all of the issues. I look forward to our remaining engaged in the future. Please, you will be automatically on our mailing list. You will have the option to opt out if you want, but we will not be leaving you alone unless you want to leave us alone. So stay engaged with us, stay engaged and pay attention to our future announcements, future activities and work. And as Bassam was saying, we will be asking you for being able to put all of the output of this conference together in order to expand the audience of these discussions beyond, as Bassam saying, through the audio journal, through the online media, through the journal publications, etc. I want to thank in particular, I'm not beginning to repeat thanks, our wonderful team at the Asfari Institute, small as it is, for their efficiency and their support. Hala and Eli and Farah and everyone else at the Institute. And I also want to thank in particular my friends and colleagues Bassam and Rania for being really a great team with us, a great intellectual and activist team in thinking through some of these issues, and hopefully we will continue to be up to your best expectations. Safe journeys home for those who have traveled, and thank you very, very much.